Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, and welcome to what is the last session of our second annual week virtual conference on artificial intelligence, work, innovation, productivity, and skills. My name is Stefano Scarpetta. I'm the Director for Employment, Labor, and Social Affairs at the OECD. It's really a great pleasure to welcome our lead speaker for our session today. Christo Wilson is Associate Professor at the Northeastern University. He's a founding member of the Cybersecurity and Privacy Institute at the Northeastern. His research focus has been on online security and privacy, with actually a specific interest in algorithmic auditing. He has published extensively on this topic, and in particular, for the interest of our conversation with Christo today, is actually the paper he has written on auditing of bias and discrimination in platform work, in resume search engines, and job candidate screening. I think the title is Building and Auditing Fair Algorithms, a case study of candidate screening. So Christo, welcome to this session of our conference. It's really a great pleasure to have you with us. I think, as we were discussing before, there's been a lot of discussion about the role of auditing of AI tools in the way in which actually they're used in the workplace. So I'm sure there will be a lot of interest in our participants. Let me just give you a few sort of housekeeping. There will be, of course, an opportunity for all our participants to the session to raise their questions. We will collect the question, and I think in the second part of our conversation with Christo, I would be happy, of course, to bring this question to him. Actually, the conference has been very successful, and a big thanks to all of those who are actually with us today for this particular session. We got more than 4,500 participants registered to the conference. We got from 130 countries, and I think all the speakers, more than 70 of them, received something like 100 and more questions to the speaker. So a lot of interest, very intensive and very active participation. So I was saying, Christo, maybe the first question to you is that there is a growing interest in the use of algorithmic auditing to improve the accountability of AI systems by assessing whether the AI systems or their use align with the ethical principles, with rules, and with laws. I think one example that was discussed during the conference is actually that the New York City has passed a bill requiring bias audits for AI-based employment decision tools. And actually, I think it will require that providers of this tool have them evaluated each year by an independent bias audit service. So this seems to be one step, at least that the New York City is actually taking, to use systematically audit tools in order to assess whether the AI tools actually respect the laws and regulation ethics standards. So based on your experience on auditing of employment-related AI system, I'm thinking, for example, biometrics audit, for example, what you have done. What do you think is the potential for auditing to actually make progress on the way in which AI systems are used and ensure that they do respect ethical standards, labor rights, and actually our laws and regulations?
So thank you again for having me. It's an honor to be here. So I'm a little bit biased because I have been auditing algorithms for 10 years now. So take what I say with a grain of salt. But I do think that audits of AI systems are really important, and that this is one part of a holistic approach to making sure that algorithms are actually behaving in ways that we think meet our values as a society. If we think about other domains that have profound implications for people's lives, like the safety of an airplane or the safety of a drug, I mean, we have regulatory regimes that require checks and evaluations of those things before they're let loose on people. Or we can talk about something like financial audits. We've long recognized that it's important to have an independent second look at things, just to make sure that that all the T's are being crossed, the I's are being dotted, and that, I mean, make sure that no one's doing anything malicious, but more to the point, just make sure that people are following best practices. I think all of those insights apply to machine learning systems as well. I don't think there's bad actors out there who are intentionally trying to have discriminatory employment software, but that doesn't mean that the systems are okay. Bias can creep into them in a variety of different ways. that aren't intentional, but it still happens and it can still have a very negative impact on people's lives. So having an independent check just to make sure that best practices are being followed, that the kinds of values we espouse are actually embedded in these systems, that they're behaving the way we expect them to out in the wild. I think that's really important if we're going to have confidence and trust in these kinds of systems.
I think confidence trust is indeed a key word here, right? And I think one question I want to ask as a follow-up is how far you think that auditing can go in identifying bias against relevant groups beyond the categories which are actually protected by law? So what can we expect? What are the boundaries? What are the limits of auditing? Going beyond, if you like, the basic things that actually our law and regulation do protect.
Yeah, so I would say that there's two boundaries here. One is the limits of regulation. So if we're talking about things like fairness in credit and lending, I mean, there are laws about what kinds of demographic data you can and can't collect in those scenarios, which then fundamentally limits your ability to go and actually analyze what's happening to say who is being affected in different ways. Regulation also has an impact in terms of what a system can be allowed to do in the first place. So this came up in the context of the Pymetrics audit. If you're following the US regulations, they say certain groups are protected and other groups are not recognized under the law as being protected. So even if I analyzed the system and said, well, it's not fair for some small group, if the law says that group isn't recognized, you've sort of put this vendor in a bind. The auditor is saying, well, it's not fair to someone. But the law says you can't make it fair for them. And so at that point, is it even fair to audit to that standard? So beyond the impact of regulation, there's the data. Fundamentally, you can't assess whether something's fair to a particular group if you have no data about that group. One of the things that we've found in our research is that if you try to infer, right, you don't have demographic data for some group and you try to infer who they are and then assess fairness, the results are typically very bad. This kind of demographic inference is hard, even for things like gender that you would assume would be sort of easy. They're not easy at all. So having really high quality demographic data or whatever sort of data you need to actually make the assessment is crucial.
Thank you, Chris. So let me follow on that, because I think we had again a discussion during the AI weeks, and I think a number of those who are more in charge of setting up the regulations said, well, we do have laws and regulations already in place. Anti-discriminatory law are there in all of our OECD countries. So the question is to make sure that these regulations are actually fully respected and enforced, also when we're dealing with the AI tools. I think from what you said, basically, we also have to rethink whether we have the up-to-date regulations to some extent, and whether the regulation cover the different dimensions of possible bias in the use of algorithms. Am I right on that? So we have to think seriously about actually the regulatory and the legislative system we have in our countries.
Yeah, I think the regulatory regime and the impact of historical court decisions are crucial here. You can't expect systems to be fair to groups that aren't recognized under the law, or alternatively, the law needs to be very flexible in saying that the person developing the system gets to decide who is and is not protected. And then that would need to be taken into account during the audit. But one thing that we constantly see is this disconnect between what the law says versus what code can actually implement. There's this tension between having language that describes fairness or language that describes equity, and then actually implementing that in practice, right? Ultimately, it has to be computer code, it has to be math, and drawing the line from one to the other isn't always obvious. So this is a choice for regulators. Do you want really specific baselines for fairness that are very narrowly scoped and very precise? That makes the developer's job much easier, but it also boxes you in to just one particular baseline. And alternatively, if the regulations are more expansive. They have a broader, more interpretive scope. When you give the developer the ability to choose kind of different kinds of fairness, and you may want that capability. But this again, it's something that lawmakers have to think very carefully about.
Interesting, because you said that basically the developers would have sort of some leeway to decide, what degree or what type of fairness, which groups the algorithm, or to some extent the coding is protecting against possible biases. Should we leave it to really the developers of the algorithms, or should we actually, to some extent, also make sure that those who are potentially affected by the decision, or to some extent the outcomes of the AI tools, are at least informed of what has been protected by algorithm and what is not?
Yeah, and so this is a really challenging question. One way to think of an audit is more like a financial audit, where the regulations and the standards very clearly delineate, how the accounting should be done, and then the audit is saying, have you met the kind of official standards of the regulation or the government or whoever? But there's another way of thinking about audits, which is just as a verification of claims. So in this regime, you have a developer, they say, we have a hiring system, and we've chosen a particular kind of fairness. Like, let's say it's predictive parity, and they would say it has predictive parity for certain groups. Given that the developer has said this publicly, the audit can be to that standard, right? The thing they said, does the system actually do it? And at that point, you can leave it up to the market and to regulators to decide, have the vendors done enough, right? It could be that one vendor says, we're just fair for men and women, and another vendor says, well, we're fair for men and women and a variety of racial and ethnic groups. And maybe people look at those two cases and say, we think the one with more expansive definitions of fairness are better. So that's the product we're going to adopt. And the market will actually decide that's the better solution. Or activists will look at the two of them and say, one of these just isn't good enough, and press regulators to say, okay, that's not up to par, right? This other thing is better. So, audits, I think, can facilitate either mode. It can be a set standard, or it can just be, we're just verifying your claims, and then everyone else gets to decide whether that's enough, but safe in the knowledge that what was said or described is actually what is happening.
That's very interesting, Christo, because basically the fact that the vendor can declare, what sort of their own product, right, is able to do, if that information were available for the potential user, the one both buy the companies that buy these tools, but also for the workers, so they know to what extent which tool their company for which they work have bought, and therefore what the algorithm is protecting them for, which dimension are taken into account. And of course, then verifying that through auditing. That's very, very interesting indeed. I want to sort of go back to the point about what are the limits, because when we talk about privacy, for example, do you think that auditing can be effective in ensuring that AI systems respect privacy and other ethical principles? So what are the boundaries, again, of what we can expect from auditing? Provide that indeed that the vendors will, to some extent, clarify what dimension are taken into account. Is privacy one of these?
I think it can be. When we were looking at Pymetrics, for example, we had access to internal data. So we could very easily see things like, is demographic data being used to train the models, right? So some people would interpret that as direct discrimination and potentially a privacy violation. And that's something we could see. So I could very easily imagine expanding the scope of this to encompass things like GDPR compliance or CCPA compliance in the United States. What's being collected? Is what's being collected being used in ways that either meet the regulatory standards or at least meet what has been said in things like privacy disclosures? An auditor with a sufficient level of access, I think, can answer those questions. But I guess the downside of this is that I'm sort of defining privacy in a very technical sense, like what was disclosed and then how is data flowing. But there's more normative aspects of this that are much more challenging. Let's say that we want fairness for people based on sexual preference. There's a deep privacy issue there, right? If I want to ensure that kind of fairness, I would need that kind of data. But are we saying that people have to disclose their sexual preferences now in order to then have fairness be assessed? I mean, there's an obvious tension there.
Absolutely. The other question I have, Christo, is, so what kind of application? I mean, to some extent, some of your work has been focusing on hiring practices, right? The use of the algorithm to basically in the hiring process. But of course, now and perhaps more and more in the future, AI can be used to assess performance, to decide whether a particular worker should go to a particular type of training. I think, again, one of the issues we've been discussing throughout the conference that to what extent actually the workers know which tools have been used for which purposes and with which outcome in terms of, again, the prospect for them to move on their career and to get progression or to participate in certain type of training. So is auditing useful also beyond hiring, but also for these other decisions on which companies already, and perhaps more in the future, will use the algorithm, to use AI?
I mean, I think audits can be useful, but we're talking about audits with a pretty broad scope at this point. We're no longer talking about you make some kind of narrow claim of predictive validity or predictive parity or what have you, and we're just assessing that. We're now talking about the validity of tools from their very inception. You're using games to assess people for candidacy at a company. Is it reasonable to use a game or a particular survey or on-the-job performance data for a particular predictive task? I mean, you could audit that, but it's starting to sound more like research. You're talking about running double-blind studies of people to assess whether the construct is even valid. And that work is hard, but it's also critical. I mean, there's plenty of cases where you see things like analysis of video, for example, being used to screen candidates. And the premise is very tenuous, in my opinion, whether someone's facial expressions mean anything with respect to job performance. It's just not a valid concept. So, I mean, I think questioning the conceptual validity of the data and the objectives is certainly within bounds.
Christo, the point you were making before about the fact that we need the data, right? So if we don't have data on group demographics, then it would be difficult to basically have the benchmark on which the audit can actually be useful. I think when we're talking about other dimension of decision making by employers on workers, of course, we need also the benchmark. What is the good benchmark to decide whether one worker, another worker should be participating in the same training or should have a chance to career promotion and so on. So I think to some extent your answer now goes in that direction. We need to see auditing against what. So what is the benchmark? What is fairness? And of course makes things much more complicated. Perhaps moving from a pure auditing into more research, which is indeed. But I think again, this is a key challenge because I think some of the fear and concern about the use of AI is precisely because it is perceived like a black box from workers, and they are concerned about some of the outcomes and not knowing exactly what is the logic, what is behind some decision that actually affect them directly. I think there is a question on the chat that I just want to share with you and ask you. And of course, all the other participants, please raise your question to Christo. So the question says, are there any metrics for firms to know whether they should implement AI auditing into their firm?
I mean, I think if you're building a tool or you're thinking of adopting a tool that is determining opportunity, so educational opportunities, whether you can rent an apartment, credit, should you hire someone? I mean, those are obvious cases where these decisions have huge import. We know that these kinds of systems will have bias unless they are explicitly built to not have bias. So if you're in any of those spaces, you need to be thinking about this issue.
Thank you. There was another question again from the chat that says, what are the steps of AI audit? So who should initiate that? I mean, of course, we talk about the New York City actually imposing auditing for employment-related decision by the companies. If it's not basically the state imposing the audits, it's just a voluntary choice by companies to also want to maintain or enhance their sort of reputation or to worker pressure. So what are the steps?
Yeah, so my idealized audit actually starts with a stakeholder analysis. So this is not about technical data science at all. This is you're sending ethnographers and anthropologists and psychologists into the field to understand the context in which your system is operating. You know, who are the stakeholders? What are their values? What are the socioeconomic and historical inequities that may impact this context? You take all that and synthesize it to determine what does fairness or equity mean in this context. That determines then the baselines for what you should be assessing towards. Then you start bringing in the lawyers to determine whether the baselines you've determined, how those interact with the law and regulation. And you can start bringing in the computer scientists and the data scientists to now look at the data, look at the system, to see whether it's achieving these correct baselines or not. And then, of course, this is a continuous process. Contexts change, data changes, year to year. You have to keep reevaluating this.
No, thank you. But I mean, you were saying, the stakeholder assessment, what it is that has to be audited. But if I were to compare that, which is more sort of something that the stakeholders within the company say decide upon, or whether this should be imposed by the state, by the government, in that case, in New York City, what do you see to be the most promising approach? So should we basically impose audits on well-defined decision that the company use an algorithm for, or should we leave basically the market, the companies also for reputational reasons and so on and so forth, to use more systematically audits when they have defined exactly what are the dimensions that the algorithm will be assessed against?
I mean, I think that we should mandate auditing, especially in these particular scenarios where we know there's a lot of potential for harm, and we know that they are deeply impacted by historical inequity. I don't see the market solving this on its own, especially because the people who are impacted in the hiring situation are workers, and to a large extent, they have the least amount of power in this scenario. The more complex question is not mandate audit or not mandate audit. It's mandate audit, but then what kind of audit? So is it just a claims validator, or is it to a particular, well-defined baseline of fairness and equity? To what extent can the baselines be chosen kind of contextually by stakeholders versus are they imposed by the regulator? What amount of transparency is required in the audit itself? So is this auditor being paid by the auditee? Does that create a conflict of interest? Does it need to be more independent than that? To what extent do the results of the audit need to be made public? Those are more challenging questions.
Absolutely, these are all fundamental points. I think the point I was making is also that even if you were to sort of mandate auditing on one specific dimension, which is the hiring of workers, I wonder where this will not set a sort of new standards. I mean, new perception of the way in which actually the AI is used in the workplace, right? Even if it's confined at the beginning on something which is a bit more specific and in which the metrics and to some extent the benchmark are more easily identifiable, hopefully leading to a process which becomes more systematic to actually do auditing.
I mean, I agree. I think that would potentially move the needle for everyone. I mean, one other thing that it may do is it may build capacity. There aren't a lot of people like me who have done algorithm audits. So to the extent that we need specialized consultants who know how to do this, or organs of government like, like an FDA or an FAA, but for AI systems, we don't really have all that capacity yet. But as soon as we pick one or two well-defined areas and say, you have to do it here, the market or the capacity to do that work will grow, and then hopefully it will be used for other things.
In fact, actually interesting, there is a follow-up question from the participant says, should the government do the auditing, or should at least mandate, in your case, the CDA case, mandate the auditing? I mean, again, to some extent, the point you were making. Any views on that? I mean, is there a capacity for government to do the auditing themselves, or is it enough for them to mandate the fact that any use of AI should be audited on something, on specific dimensions of the decisions that are used?
I mean, where there's a will, there's a way. I think if governments wanted to do this, they could find the resources to make it happen. Should they do it? I don't know. I guess I'm of two minds on this. I mean, we've seen government regulatory regimes that were just deeply ineffective, but we've also seen market-based regulatory regimes that were also deeply ineffective. The worst case scenario for me is one in which we mandate audits, but we don't mandate that they be transparent or independent enough. And then they just become these pointless exercises where you bring in a consultant, they do some shoddy work, it's not transparent, you don't even really know what they did, but it results in some kind of official seal that says, oh, this was audited, and it's all for nothing.
But do you see sort of a market building up whereby the sort of private auditors are out there pretending that they can sort of audit the use of AI, and some company may be using it as a tick the box and move on? So yeah, I use this algorithm, I use this AI tool, I got the auditor from the market, tick the box and move on. I mean, is there a risk that this becomes something which is maybe a routine, but we don't really know how effective the auditing itself is? And this might affect even the reputation of the auditing process altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very real danger. If we're gonna regulate this and mandate it, the regulations at least have to do the work to make sure that outcome doesn't happen. Whether that means just revising, or at least revisiting and revising every couple of years to make sure it's working as expected, or putting in professional accreditations for auditors. I think there's a variety of levers that you could pull to try and prevent that outcome. But yeah, if we're going to do this, we have to keep that bad outcome in mind and do everything we can to prevent it.
There's also an interesting question, which is basically ex ante or ex post of the user. The question is about, are there any tools to help test or possible to audit the readiness of an AI tool before its deployment?
Yeah, so there definitely are. There's both academic literature that says how you should be doing internal auditing, but also tools so that while you're going through the process of building and evaluating your system, you're not just looking at the baseline things like the accuracy, you're also looking at these fairness dimensions. So the tools for doing that are rapidly improving. And frankly, the companies that adopt those things ahead of time, they're setting themselves up for success. The auditor's job is much, much easier when they come into a scenario and the company has already defined, these are the groups for which we're assessing fairness, and this is how we're assessing fairness, and these are the tools we've used, and these are the tests we've ran. If that's all been done well, the audit is actually much simpler, right? You're just checking that work to say, yeah, okay, you've already done the work and it seems fine, right? The audit's over.
Oh, thanks. So basically, the point is not only to mandate the audit, but also to well identify what are the parameters of the audit. So, do you think there is also a role for government in setting up what are the key parameters that the audit should to some extent follow? I mean, for what
Absolutely.
Purpose, which kind of algorithm we're looking at, and what are the key parameters? And then I think the mandating of that in specific case, I mean, for specific use of AI can actually be something that can become obligatory and mandated.
Yeah. I mean, the ideal regulation is one that really specifies this so that we can trust the process and the outcome, but that doesn't go so far that it doesn't allow any sort of flexibility in terms of, let's say, determining exactly what fairness is defined as. Like, I'm thinking of the US scenario where people have settled on the 4/5 rule, which is not a great rule in my opinion, but we can't get out of it because it's specified in this guidance. So, if a company wanted to do things like make an algorithm that is affirmative for certain groups, they can't really do that. And that's not good, in my opinion. A company that wants to go above and beyond the standard should be able to do that. It's just a question of how do you write the regulations to allow that?
That's a very important point. Christo, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating half an hour at the end of our long conference. Thank you so much. I think you raised a number of very important issues. I think you gave a bit of hope that indeed there is certainly a significant scope of auditing. But also I think we have been discussing how the auditing should be promoted, the role of government, but also obviously identify exactly what the audit is there for. Thank you so much for sharing with us your thought and actually the result of your extensive work in this area. And a big thanks to all the participants to our conference. Again, thank you for raising your question. Thank you for being with us today. And with that, I say goodbye to all of you. Good rest of the day. And big thanks again to you, Christo.
No, thank you. And goodbye to everyone.